United Airlines Flight 585 Colorado Springs. On March 3rd, 1991, United Airlines Flight 585, a Boeing 737-200, was on its final leg of a routine connection from Denver to Colorado Springs, carrying 20 passengers and 5 crew members. The weather was clear with good visibility. No distress calls were made. At 9:44 in the morning, witnesses on the ground near Widefield Park watched the aircraft roll steadily to the right and pitch nose down until it was almost vertical, then strike the ground at full speed. There were no survivors. The NTSB could not determine a cause, and for 10 years, the case was listed as one of only 3 unsolved aviation disasters in American history. Then in September 1994, USAir Flight 427, another Boeing 737, rolled over and crashed outside Pittsburgh under almost identical circumstances, killing 132 people. The NTSB launched a combined investigation. What they eventually confirmed after years of engineering analysis and recovered hardware from both crashes was a defect in the Boeing 737's rudder power control unit, a component in service since the 1960s. Under specific conditions of temperature and pressure, the servo valve inside the unit could reverse, causing the rudder to deflect hard in the opposite direction from what the pilots commanded. In both crashes, the crews had been applying full rudder correction in one direction, while the aircraft's rudder was actually moving the other way. The investigation uncovered internal Boeing documents showing engineers had discussed the phenomenon as far back as the 1960s. A Boeing internal meeting in 1992 began with the words, "We have a problem." That document took years to extract from Boeing through legal and regulatory proceedings. It was not voluntarily disclosed. The rudder control unit was ultimately redesigned and retrofitted across the entire global 737 fleet, a process that took until approximately 2008 to complete more than 17 years after the first crash it had caused. Between United 585 and USAir 427, 157 people died from a flaw that Boeing engineers had identified and internally discussed before either crash occurred. The NTSB's revised final report on United 585 was published in 2001, 10 years after the crash. Susan Ziegler, whose husband died in the accident, spent years pressuring the NTSB and Boeing for answers, filing public records requests and tracking down internal documents that Boeing had not disclosed voluntarily. She is widely credited by aviation safety researchers with having kept public pressure on the investigation during the years when the NTSB was struggling to identify the cause. TWA Flight 800 Long Island on July 17, 1996. Transworld Airlines Flight 800, a Boeing 747-100, departed John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York at 8:19 in the evening, bound for Rome with 230 passengers and crew. 12 minutes after takeoff at an altitude of approximately 13,700 feet over the Atlantic Ocean south of Long Island, the aircraft exploded and fell into the sea in multiple pieces. It was the 3rd deadliest aviation accident in American history at the time, and one of the most intensive aviation investigations ever conducted in the United States. The FBI initially assumed terrorism and opened a criminal investigation that ran parallel to the NTSB's safety inquiry for months. More than 700 eyewitnesses reported seeing what appeared to be a streak of light traveling toward the aircraft before the explosion, fueling persistent and widely covered speculation about a missile strike. More than 96% of the aircraft was eventually recovered from the ocean floor over an 18-month salvage operation, including large sections of fuselage that were physically reassembled in a hangar to trace the sequence of events. What investigators determined was the center wing fuel tank positioned between the 2 wing tanks and containing a relatively small amount of fuel that day had accumulated explosive fuel vapor fumes in the space above the fuel. The ignition source was most likely arcing from aged wiring in a fuel quantity indication system sensor that ran through the tank. The Boeing 747's center wing tank design routed hot air from the air conditioning packs directly beneath it, keeping the tank and its vapor-filled ullage space at elevated temperatures. This was a known engineering consideration, and the conditions that produced explosive vapor had been documented in Boeing analysis going back years. The FAA and Boeing had discussed the fuel tank flammability issue at industry meetings. No mandatory modification had been required. The FBI's parallel terrorism investigation lasted 16 months and concluded that no evidence of a criminal act had been found. But the FBI's involvement had delayed the NTSB's own investigation and created ongoing friction over access to evidence. More than 1,000 eyewitness statements describing a streak of light were formally compiled and analyzed. The NTSB concluded the witnesses had most likely seen the aircraft itself, burning and climbing briefly after the nose separated before the fuselage fell toward the ocean. After TWA 800, the FAA eventually mandated fuel tank inerting systems on commercial aircraft, which replace oxygen-rich vapor in the fuel tanks with inert nitrogen gas, eliminating the explosive mixture entirely. The regulation took years to finalize and decades more to be fully implemented across the aging commercial fleet. USAir Flight 427 Pittsburgh. On September 8, 1994, USAir Flight 427, a Boeing 737-300, was approaching Pittsburgh International Airport on final approach when it suddenly rolled hard to the left, entered a steep dive, and struck the ground at an extremely high velocity in a wooded area near Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. All 132 people on board were killed. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sound of the captain exclaiming, "Whoa!" approximately 2 seconds before the aircraft began its fatal roll, suggesting the movement was so sudden and violent that it provided no meaningful warning time. The NTSB's investigation of USAir 427, conducted simultaneously with its reopened investigation of United Airlines 585, consumed 5 years and became the longest and most expensive aviation accident investigation in the agency's history up to that point. Investigators tested more than 100 possible failure scenarios in a full flight simulator before identifying the rudder reversal mechanism. The challenge was replicating the exact thermal and pressure conditions inside the rudder power control unit that produced the reversal conditions that were temperature-dependent brief and almost impossible to provoke intentionally. The final report, published in 1999, confirmed that the probable cause of both the Pittsburgh and Colorado Springs crashes was a rudder hardover in the direction opposite to the pilot's input, caused by a jam in the servo valve of the main rudder power control unit. Boeing had certified the original design in the 1960s under regulations that did not require the rudder system to be fail-safe against a single jam. By the time both crash investigations were complete, Boeing had already agreed to a redesign. What the investigations had also established through the retrieved internal documents was that Boeing had known the servo valve could jam and reverse the rudder at least since 1974, when a similar uncommanded rudder movement was documented in a Convair aircraft using the same manufacturer's valve. That information had not been shared with the FAA or with airlines operating the 737. Between the two crashes, 17 years of the same defective hardware had been in service across the global Boeing 737 fleet, which by the time of the Pittsburgh crash numbered more than 2,700 aircraft worldwide. Every one of them was equipped with the same rudder power control unit. The retrofit program, once finally mandated, required modification of every 737 in operation globally. The time between the first documented crash attributable to the defect and the completion of the last retrofit was approximately 17 years. Boeing 737 MAX MCAS crisis. This entry covers 2 crashes rather than 1 because the second crash cannot be understood without the first, and because the corporate decisions that caused both occurred at Boeing's facilities and in Boeing's engineering and certification processes in the United States. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610, a brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8, crashed into the Java Sea 12 minutes after takeoff from Jakarta, killing all 189 people aboard. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, another 737 MAX 8, she crashed 6 minutes after takeoff from Addis Ababa, killing all 157 people aboard. Both crashes were caused by the same system, MCS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, a software feature Boeing had added to the MAX to compensate for the different handling characteristics of the new larger engines positioned further forward on the wing. MCS was designed to automatically push the aircraft's nose down if its angle of attack sensor indicated a potential stall. The system relied on data from a single angle of attack sensor with no cross-checking redundancy. When that sensor failed and transmitted incorrect data, MCAS pushed the nose down against the pilot's inputs and continued doing so every time the pilots corrected it in a cycle that the aircraft's own design gave the crew no reliable way to break. Airlines and pilots had never been told MCAS existed. Boeing had decided not to include it in the flight manual or the training curriculum, in part because disclosing it might have triggered a requirement for additional simulator training, which would have made the MAX more expensive to operate and less competitive with Airbus's A320neo. Congressional investigations later revealed that Boeing employees had discussed internally the risk of relying on a single sensor for MCAS, that some had raised concerns, and that the FAA's certification process for the MAX had been heavily delegated to Boeing's own employees, who had approved safety analyses containing errors that regulators never independently verify. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide for 21 months, the longest grounding in American aviation history. Boeing paid $2.5 billion in settlements and fines. The company's CEO was replaced. The Department of Justice charged Boeing with fraud for having deceived the FAA during certification. 346 people were dead from a software system whose existence had been deliberately kept from the people flying the aircraft. Air Florida Flight 90, Washington, D.C., on January 13, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90. A Boeing 737-222 sat at Washington National Airport for almost an hour before takeoff, while ground crews de-iced the aircraft. At 3:59 in the afternoon, during a heavy snowstorm, the aircraft began its takeoff roll on runway 36. The Boeing 737 had been de-iced, but the crew had not activated the engine anti-ice systems, a decision that caused the engine pressure ratio gauges to read higher than actual thrust, giving the pilots false assurance that the engines were producing more power than they actually were. The aircraft was also heavier than normal, with accumulated ice on its wings and fuselage, and had been positioned too close to a DC-9 in front of it on the taxiway, allowing hot engine exhaust from that aircraft to partially remelt and refreeze slush on Air Florida 90's wings. The 737 became airborne at the very end of the runway, with barely enough speed to fly, struggled to climb, barely cleared the 14th Street Bridge at an altitude that witnesses described as shockingly low, struck the bridge railing and multiple vehicles in rush hour traffic, and plunged into the frozen Potomac River. Of the 79 people on board, 74 were killed. 4 motorists on the bridge were also killed. 5 people aboard the aircraft survived. All of them recovered from the partially submerged tail section in water just above freezing in one of the most dramatic air crash rescues in American television history. A bystander, Lenny Skutnik, plunged into the icy river to help a survivor who had lost the strength to hold a rescue line, an act of spontaneous heroism that was broadcast nationally and cited by President Reagan in his State of the Union address the following month. The NTSB attributed the accident to the crew's failure to use engine anti-icing and their decision to take off with ice contamination on the wings, as well as inadequate de-icing procedures at the airport. The investigation also identified the role of the crew's long wait on the ground, during which previously applied de-icing fluid degraded while ice continued to accumulate, as a systemic issue in cold weather operations that the industry had not adequately addressed. Alaska Airlines Flight, TWA Portland, on January 5, 2024. Alaska Airlines Flight 1282, a Boeing 737 MAX 9, took off from Portland International Airport at 5:12 in the afternoon, bound for Ontario, California, carrying 171 passengers and 6 crew members. The flight had been in the air for approximately 10 minutes, climbing through 16,000 feet, when a 2x4-foot panel covering a mid-exit door plug position on the left side of the fuselage tore away from the aircraft in flight. The rapid decompression that followed ripped objects from the cabin into the sky. A headrest, clothing, and other items were ejected. A 16-year-old boy, seated directly beside the opening, had his shirt pulled from his body. An infant in a nearby row was held to a seat by a parent, gripping the child's legs. Several passengers were not wearing seatbelts and were thrown against the ceiling. No one was ejected, and no one was killed, a fact that the NTSB later attributed explicitly to the seats beside the opening being unoccupied on that flight. The door plug was recovered in the backyard of a home in Portland. NTSB investigators found that 4 retention bolts designed to prevent the plug from moving upward and separating from the frame were missing. The bolts had been removed during a manufacturing repair process at Boeing's Renton, Washington factory in the weeks before the aircraft was delivered to Alaska Airlines in October 2023. No record existed of who had removed them. No record existed of who had been assigned to reinstall them. Boeing's own manufacturing documentation did not require sign-off confirming the bolts had been replaced before the aircraft moved to the next stage of production. The plug had been gradually moving upward over the preceding 154 flights as it was held in place only by its guide fittings rather than its bolts. Each flight incrementally working it further from its seat until the pressure differential on the 155th flight finally overcame the remaining resistance. The NTSB's final report, published in 2025, attributed the probable cause to Boeing's failure to maintain adequate manufacturing oversight and training, and cited the FAA's failure to identify and enforce correction of systemic quality control deficiencies at the Renton facility. Boeing workers who spoke to investigators described feeling pressured to work too fast on the production line. The NTSB chair stated at the public hearing that the crew of Flight 1282 had been heroes, but that they should not have needed to be, because Boeing and the FAA should have prevented the condition that required their heroism. A 16-year-old boy seated in the row closest to the opening, whose shirt had been ripped from his body by the decompression, was treated and released. The seat directly beside the opening, the seat most exposed and most likely to have resulted in a fatality or ejection, was empty. The NTSB calculated that if that seat had been occupied, the outcome of the incident would almost certainly have been different. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.